We know that there are foods that don't spike insulin very much, but we don't really think about fruits very often. We think of fruits as just super sweet things that we probably should have in moderation, and that's true, but not all fruits are created equal. There are fruits that barely spike insulin, and we're going to talk about them and talk about why they barely affect insulin in the body. First thing we have to look at is something very important, and that is the glucose content and the fructose content of fruit. Now, fruit gets beat up all the time because of fructose, but one of the things we need to remember is although fructose is still a sugar, it does not trigger the release of insulin. Okay? It can still affect blood glucose to a degree, but it's not going to spike your insulin. So this is a very powerful thing. Now, on the contrary, too much fructose has been linked with fatty liver disease and some other things. So we don't want to go overboard. We still want to, limit it to a half cup, maybe a cup of fruit, no matter what kind of dietary pattern you're doing. But we want to look at the ratio of glucose, sucrose, and fructose. Okay? So glucose, which is in some fruits and lots of fruits, those are going to be the molecules that really spike insulin quick. Okay? Then you have sucrose. Sucrose is what's called a disaccharide. It's a combination of glucose and fructose together. Okay, so that means when it goes in your body, the body breaks apart that bond and takes a disaccharide into a monosaccharide. So now you have one glucose and one fructose. So sucrose still affects your blood glucose, just not the same that pure glucose would. So we're looking for fruits that have higher levels of fructose, but also have additional factors like polyphenols and different compounds that can affect insulin sensitivity. Let's talk about the first one, which is avocado. Now, you don't typically think of avocado as a fruit. You usually think of avocado as a fat, and that's probably the right way to think, but it's still really fascinating. There's a study that was published in Nutrition Journal that wanted to take a look at what happened if people had fresh avocado along with a meal. So they did some studies and they found that just having a half of a fresh avocado along with a meal significantly attenuated the insulin response 30 minutes after the meal, but also 3 hours after the meal. Okay, so at first you think, well, maybe it's just the fat content slowing things down, which is probably the case. Maybe it's the fiber content slowing down the digestion of the carbs. Yes, that's probably the case. But when you look a little bit further, there's something very cool going on. There's a study that was published in the Molecular Nutrition and Food Research Journal that found that there's a compound called avocatin B. Kind of appropriately named, but what this avocatin B does is it works with fatty acid oxidation. So it's technically a fat molecule. And what it does is it can help support how the mitochondria utilizes fat. So first off, what they did is they took a look at mice and they had them go on a high-fat, high-calorie diet for 8 weeks to kind of induce obesity and insulin resistance. And then they gave them direct amounts of avocatin B. Now, they only did this to half of the mice, and they found that the group of mice that got the avocatin B ended up having pretty darn significant improvements in insulin sensitivity. So we go back to kind of the mechanism here. Okay, what happens is if you have copious amounts of fat circulating through the bloodstream that you're not really utilizing, that absolutely can affect insulin sensitivity. People forget that yes, fats still have an impact on how our glucose receptors work and things like that. If the glucose receptors are basically getting clouded by fat all the time, then they're not sensitive to the glucose that is in the bloodstream. So what the mechanism here is this avocatin B allows for full oxidation of fatty acids. Normally, fatty acids come into the mitochondria, they get processed and turned into fuel. But throughout that process, we have incomplete oxidation, meaning not all of the fat ends up getting oxidized, which means we end up with spare parts of the fat still circulating. This avocatin B helps ensure that the full fatty acid is getting oxidized, therefore less circulating fat. So it's actually doing two things. It's clearing up the bloodstream a little bit more so glucose can get taken up properly, helping with glucose management, but it's also helping with fatty acid oxidation, making sure the fat that is circulating is getting entirely utilized. So avocados have that awesome dual purpose. Now moving on. Okay, the next one, apples. You would think that apples are like the worst fruit because they're so sweet, and we think apple juice being just this hyper sweet juice from concentrate, garbage, right? Believe it or not, apples are pretty darn decent. We're talking a glycemic index scale that's very low. When you look at an average apple, you're looking anywhere from, say, 15 grams to 20 grams, 25 grams of total carbohydrates, okay? Now, of that, we're looking at only maybe 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 total grams of glucose, including glucose that has been separated from sucrose, okay? Not saying you go out and eat a huge, large apple, but a half of an apple is really mainly fructose. So there's a study that was published in the journal Nutrients that found that an apple preload before a serving of rice affected blood glucose and insulin after the meal. Okay, so just having some apple coming in actually can slow down that insulin response. And there's a couple things at play, but one of the most important things, believe it or not, is a specific polyphenol. Okay, there's polyphenols that are in apples, and these have been demonstrated in different mechanistic studies to inhibit or slow down what is called sodium-dependent glucose transporter 1. Now, sodium-dependent glucose transporter 1 is probably the most common, most popular known about glucose transporter. It's what transports glucose into the bloodstream. So if we have less of those transporters, we have less glucose getting into the bloodstream. So you have a two-part equation here. A fruit that is very high in fructose, that's barely spiking insulin to begin with, and then you have the glucose that is there barely able to get on a bus, right? So it really makes a big difference when you look at the big picture. Then, of course, there's the fiber component. Apples have a couple grams of fiber, which definitely has an effect. Not only does fiber have an effect at slowing down that glucose piece, but fiber also ends up feeding the microbiome, which can help with glucose tolerance to begin with. Okay, by feeding and supporting the microbiome, then we end up with more what are called short-chain fatty acids, which are a signaling device to help with glucose tolerance, help with glucose processing, fatty acid oxidation. It's the same kind of thing you get or you're aiming for when you're taking care of your gut with like a probiotic or probiotic foods. People ask all the time, the probiotic I would recommend, and today's video sponsor is Seed. Check them out. They are a really cool daily Synbiotic. They're the probiotic that I use, so when we're talking about microbiome, definitely something I would recommend. And because they are a sponsor of this video, you save 15% off when you use that code down below in the description. So Unique Technology has a capsule inside of a capsule. You probably haven't seen a probiotic like this before. Okay, and because it's a Synbiotic, they also have prebiotic fibers, like the kind of fibers you may find in apples or other fruits or veggies, right? So you're supporting the bacteria that is in the actual capsule too. So definitely recommend you check them out. Like if I'm traveling, it's a go-to. So that link is down below in the description, and a thank you to Seed for sponsoring this content. Next up, cherries. Okay, I'm not talking about maraschino cherries, like, you know, that are gonna be put on your whipped cream or whatever. I'm talking about either like regular sour cherries or even regular sweet cherries. Funny enough, they have one of the lowest glycemic indexes of any fruit. We're talking like a 22 on the glycemic index scale, but you don't wanna have more than about a half a cup of cherries, okay? You really wanna control how much you have. Now, they're really cool because yes, they're predominantly fructose, which is great. They also have the polyphenols that are going to affect overall glucose metabolism, just like we talked about with apples. But they also stimulate something called AMPK. Okay, AMPK is an energy sensor in your body, but when foods peak a little bit of that AMPK or spike it, what's gonna happen is it acts like a vacuum in your body, like a big old Hoover vacuum. Glucose that is in your bloodstream is like, gets sucked up just like a vacuum. So this is a very important thing, but that's not it. Cherries have a unique thing going on. Cherries have something called anthocyanins, which we talked about before on this channel, but some pretty cool research that's been coming out lately. There's a study that was published in the journal Nutrients. This is cool because it looked at this in human models, animal models, and in just culture models, like in a cell. And they found that what's going on is this anthocyanin is increasing glucose uptake into the liver. Okay, and when it does that, it's making it so that the response to insulin is better. Okay, that way you're having less circulating through the bloodstream and more getting sort of corralled into the right place where it can potentially send a signal. But again, you want to make sure you're not overdoing it on the cherries because you also don't want to be pounding a bunch of glucose into the liver. But it's just a nice little thing to know about that. The other interesting thing about the anthocyanins is they seem to sort of slow down the breakdown of complex carbs. So cherries could be something that you want to have alongside starches because they can actually slow down how those starch chains are broken down. So cherries on their own, great. Cherries on some pancakes or something, even better. Now we move into grapefruit, which is talked about a lot. Grapefruit already super low glycemic index. We're already talking a small amount of glucose, only 6 to 7 grams of glucose in an entire large grapefruit, plus a pretty hefty fiber content. But let's go ahead and just get to the fun stuff. There was a study published in the journal Medicinal Food, took a look at 91 obese people. Okay, it gave them a few different things. It gave them apple juice plus a placebo pill, or it gave them half of a grapefruit plus a placebo pill, or it gave them grapefruit juice plus a placebo pill, or it gave them a grapefruit capsule plus apple juice. Okay, this is pretty cool. They gave them this along with a meal or just prior to a meal. Results were pretty interesting. The grapefruit fruit group, the group that actually had the grapefruit itself, they lost the most weight. But then all the other groups that still had some form of grapefruit ended up having an improvement in insulin sensitivity. And overall, just their insulin scores were better after a meal compared to control. So what's going on here? Well, more than likely, based upon other research, it's something called naringin, or naringin, depending on potato for you. So according to the archives of biochemistry and biophysics, naringin affects us by sort of acting upon our antioxidant pathways. So it acts as an antioxidant and as an anti-inflammatory. And when you look further at the data, you see that it is this mechanism that is sort of ameliorating that response to insulin, or that insulin response in general. So somehow, through the antioxidant pathway and anti-inflammatory pathway, naringin affects how we utilize glucose. Not to mention, within this same vein, we're also upregulating AMPK, just like I talked about before, sort of acting as that vacuum to suck up glucose. Okay, now we move into one that's really fun that people don't think about, and that is guava. We think guava, we think tropical fruit, no way in heck can I have it. Okay, well, it's interesting because guava has a pretty high fructose content, which is probably why it's so sweet. Okay, so if you're talking like 50, 100 gram serving of guava, you're pretty much good to go. But then we also see some interesting stuff with guava in and of itself, like by looking at guava leaf. Okay, if you look at studies that look at guava leaf tea, there's some pretty promising things. There was a study that was published in Nutrition and Metabolism that found that guava leaf tea administered with a meal ended up inhibiting what's called alpha glucosidase, which breaks down carbs. So if you were to consume, say, I don't know, guava leaf tea along with a carb-rich meal, it might slow down how the carbohydrates break down. Additionally, there's a study published in Phytotherapy Research that found that longer-term administration of guava leaf tea, or guava leaf in general, affected hepatic hexokinase. Now, hepatic hexokinase is an enzyme that is very important in the phosphorylation of glucose into glucose 6-phosphate. This is the first step in breaking down glucose. So not only affecting it at a starch level, but literally affecting it down to the glucose molecule level. This is why we may be seeing an improvement in sort of insulin sensitivity along with this guava leaf. Now, you're not always eating the guava leaf, but it goes to show that maybe the polyphenols that are in that, or whatever's in it, is probably carrying through to the fruit too, which in and of itself is already a high fructose, low glucose fruit. And last but not least, one that I've talked about before is raspberries. When it comes down to the berries, it's the best berry. Okay, now the carb content seems a little bit high when you first look at it, like 100 grams or maybe a cup-ish or so. You're still looking like 15, 16 grams of carbs, but 8 grams of it is fiber. So that's a huge thing. Okay, one of the highest fiber berries that there is, but then also there's tannins in it, and the tannins affect what's called alpha amylase. Okay, that actually affects the breakdown of starches in and of itself and the absorption. So then you have sort of this inhibition of carbohydrates to begin with. So just to recap, you've got avocado, you've got apples, you've got cherries, you've got grapefruit, which is always awesome to have with breakfast. Okay, then you also have guava, and you have good old raspberries. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. Don't forget to check out Seed down below, and I'll see you tomorrow.